something where there is an enormous opportunity for our manufacturing sector to come from creating a supply chain which is based here in the United Kingdom, rather than having to bring capacity back from overseas.
I agree with the right honourable gentleman, and congratulations on his role when he was in the Scotland office as well. He did much work, and we hope to emulate much of that work. I've met with EMEC in his own constituency, and indeed met with the tidal resources up there. It's critically important for our net zero ambitions and to get to clean power by 2030. I'm due to meet them when I visit his constituency in the coming weeks, and I'll make sure it's top of the agenda.
Christine Jardine, the Lib Democratic spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd also like to welcome the Secretary of State to his place and congratulate him, and also, if I could associate myself with his earlier remarks, particularly about Scotland's Olympians and Paralympians. I was also delighted to hear the recognition in his first answer about the role that our universities will play in a new industrial strategy, which is going to be vital in Scotland, particularly in the light of the admissions made recently about the Scottish National Party, about the mess that they have made of our economy in Scotland. Which is why I was baffled to see the UK Government cutting £800 million from a supercomputer project at the University of Edinburgh, with potential to support research in drug discovery, climate change and advanced engineering. So what discussions did he have with the Chancellor of the Exchequer about the impact?
Well, as the Honourable Lady will know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer did a full audit of government spending in the first weekend that she was in office and found a £22 billion black hole. The exascale computer that she talks about was announced by two previous Prime Ministers, two previous Chancellors, and indeed was in the budget back in the early part of this year, but no money was allocated, and therefore the project has been paused pending both the budget on the 30th of October and the spending review next year.
Elaine Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am proud to be part of a UK Government which will oversee the biggest upgrade of workers' rights in a generation. We have set out the New Deal for working people and will write this into law within our first 100 days. Over 75 reforms will deliver on a core part of our growth mission to raise living standards, and there are up to 7,800 workers across Ayrshire that stand to benefit from Labour's plans to make work pay.
In addition to this Government's action on the New Deal for working people, we should ensure that a fair deal for those who powered our country in the past. In my previous work with the Coalfield Regeneration Trust, I know the vital difference that extra support makes to these communities and their families. Can the Secretary of State give an update on the proposals to end the injustice of the mine workers' pension scheme before it is too late?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mine workers from my own constituency of Midlothian, my honourable friend's constituency and from across our coalfields powered this country. So I am delighted that our Labour manifesto committed to ending the injustice of the mine workers' pension scheme by conducting a review of both the unfair surplus arrangements and on transferring the investment reserve fund back to members. I'd be delighted to write to my honourable friend and other members representing coalfield seats with a further update in due course.
Dave Duggan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State to his position. He'll know that the Scottish Government has its own tax-raising powers. He'll remember criticising the Scottish Government for not using them, then criticising the Scottish Government when we did use them. But nevertheless, it generates £1.5 billion extra revenue in Scotland by taxing those who earn more, slightly more, allows us to tax those who are earning slightly less, even less than they do in the rest of the United Kingdom. What advice would he give the Chancellor to mirror those efforts in Scotland to have a more progressive and fair tax system for our workers?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member will be aware that the IFS has said this morning that the tax policies of the Scottish Government have actually cost Scotland money rather than raised it. And he will know too that this Government has had to undertake a comprehensive audit of spending to make sure that we can clear up the mess that we've inherited. The £22 billion black hole is real. The Treasury reserves have been spent more than 3 times over, and he'll be aware that our focus for the Chancellor is on making sure that we fix the foundations and get the economy back on track.
David Mundell.
Question number 4, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This Government is committed to delivering economic growth in all parts of the country, and we're working closely with local partners and the Scottish Government on the Borderlands Growth Deal, and together we are ensuring it delivers the uplift in economic benefits as set out in the deal.
Mr Speaker, I congratulate the Honourable Lady on her appointment, but particularly the Secretary of State on his appointment. being on your own in this House is a really tough gig, and he exercised it in exemplary fashion over 7 years. But as I found, having new colleagues brings a whole new set of challenges on its own. Can I ask the Honourable Lady if she will ensure that the mountain bike centre at the Carley Mill in Innerleithen is prioritised? There has been a suggestion that the project will not now go ahead in that location. It's vital that we have that centre, and it's vital that that mill is refurbished.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So the UK Government has pledged £19 million for the Mounterbike Innovation Centre project as part of the Borderlands Growth Deal. My officials are working closely with all local partners, including the Scottish Borders Council, to progress the project, and I expect to update on the development of the project shortly.
John Brady.
Question 5, please, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for the question, and congratulations on winning Glasgow East. The people of Scotland want their two governments to spend more time fighting for them than fighting each other. That's why resetting the relationship has been a priority for this government and indeed the Prime Minister. I've had numerous productive meetings with Scottish ministers, including the Deputy First Minister. We've had 17 days of visits across Scotland. 7 Cabinet members have already visited, dozens of calls between Secretaries of State and Cabinet Secretaries, and I look forward to working with the Scottish Government to deliver our shared priorities for the people of Scotland.
John Brady.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Scotland's official economic forecaster, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, has said about the Scottish budget that much of the pressure comes from the Scottish Government's own decisions. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that the Scottish Government must accept responsibility for the catastrophic state of Scottish public finances?
Very grateful for that question from the honourable gentleman. He is right. The Scottish Fiscal Commission did say that much of the pressure comes from the Scottish Government's own decision making, and while this new government is cleaning up the mess of the previous Conservative government, the SNP seem to be cleaning up their own mess at the moment. In 2023, Audit Scotland said that, and I quote, the Scottish Government projections suggest it cannot afford to pay for the public services in their current form. And as we've already heard, the IFS quote said this morning that SNP decisions have reduced tax take rather than increased it. This is about treating taxpayers' money with respect and being honest about the tough choices that we face. An honest assessment of the SNP government's budget is that these problems have been stored up for years, tough decisions have been kicked into the long grass, and money has been spent recklessly. A problem of their own making that the Scottish people will suffer from as they try and clear it up.
Secretary of State John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I also start by congratulating both the new ministers on their appointments to the Scotland Office. I certainly love my time at the Scotland Office, and I know they're going to be very well supported by the excellent team of officials in the department, some of whom are in the box today. Now, Mr Speaker, Labour plan to end the winter fuel payment, taking money away from elderly people who have worked all their days. Age Scotland have said, and I quote, at minimum, 250,000 pensioners in Scotland on the lowest incomes or living in fuel poverty will no longer receive this vital financial support over the winter months, while hundreds of thousands more on modest incomes are going to struggle. Labour have cut it across the UK, and the SNP are doing their dirty work in Scotland. What does the Minister have to say to the 250,000 elderly Scots who are in poverty, struggling with Labour and the SNP's decisions?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I welcome the Shadow Secretary of State to his new post. The Chancellor set out during the inheritance statement a few weeks ago the dreadful legacy that his government, that he was a member of, left this current government to fix the foundations and try and clear up. These were decisions that the Chancellor didn't want to make or didn't expect to make, but indeed have had to be made in order to try and get the finances in balance and to try and make sure we can fix those foundations to deliver our manifesto. That is the legacy of this government, and as has already been mentioned in the previous answer to the start of this question, the SNP have already made a mess of the public finances over the last 17 years, and as we've seen yesterday in the Scottish Parliament, they've got one hell of a mess to clear up, and it's Scottish pensioners and Scottish people that will pay the price.
John Lamont.
It seems, Mr Speaker, that Labour are taking a leaf from the SNP's playbook and refusing to take responsibility for their own actions. This is happening because of choices made by this Labour government which have been passed on by the SNP in Edinburgh. Now, his party's election slogan was all about change. Under this Labour government, pensioners don't seem to have any change to spare. One woman called Leslie told Age Scotland, this payment is literally a lifesaver for us. Another, Brian, told them, I would freeze without it or go hungry. Is this the change that Labour meant, taking money away from struggling pensioners?
Mr Speaker, there seems to be no recognition or apology from the Shadow Secretary of State in terms of the legacy they've left this government to try and clear up. We knew about, of course, the massive overspending in public services from the previous government and, of course, the £22 billion black hole that was revealed by the Chancellor in the audit that she did in her first weekend in office. These things have to be fixed. They are tough decisions we didn't expect to make. They're certainly tough decisions we didn't want to make, but we've had to make them to fix the foundations of our economy.
Mr Speaker, can I add my congratulations to the Secretary of State? I know it's not always been easy and sometimes been a lonely path, so a personal congratulations, and to the member for Midlothian for taking her place. In terms of improving the relationship between the Scottish and the UK Government, I'm going to take the Secretary of State at face value, but you'll be aware of the devastating consequences of the cut to the winter fuel payments on pensioners in both our constituencies and across Scotland. So in terms of working better with the Scottish Government, will he do better than just give them 90 minutes notice next time?
Mr Speaker, I welcome the honourable gentleman back to his place, having re-won his new constituency of Arbroath and Broadferry at the election. I think the honourable gentleman should look at what the Finance Secretary in Scotland did in the Scottish Parliament yesterday. She announced £500 million of cuts, including £120 million in health services, £20 million in mental health services, and has sold the family inheritance by using the Scotland money to plug the additional funding gaps in their budget. The Audit Scotland has been clear, the IFS has been clear. This is a problem of their own making, so if they want to reset the relationship, they could start by taking responsibility for their own actions.
Stephen Gittins.
Question 6, please, Mr Speaker.
I'm just giving the Minister number 6. I'm committed to working with the Scottish Government, and I've already met with the Deputy First Minister 4 times in 8 weeks. Resetting the relationship between Scotland's two governments is crucial to driving economic growth. Just last week, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was in Glasgow and met with the First Minister. The Prime Minister has made it a key part of his new way of working in government to reset that relationship and has met with the First Minister to have those discussions. And members of the business community discussed growing the Scottish economy. It's all of our choices to grow the Scottish economy, and something we all need to do together.
Stephen Gittins.
Mr Speaker, and I'll thank the Secretary of State for his response. He will be aware that macroeconomic policy sits here, that decisions taken sit here that have a huge impact. Now, we've worked on this issue in the past before. Does he agree with the SNP that being outside the customs union in the single market is bad for growth in the Scottish economy? Or does he agree with the Conservatives and their colleagues in Reform that it's been good for the Scottish economy?
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman is taking no responsibility for the decisions that his party makes in the Scottish Government. We've seen that yesterday in terms of the plugging the holes in their own public finances. The IFS have been clear that the decisions they have made has taken the tax take down in Scotland, despite it being the highest tax part of the country. And I think it's time, if we are to reset this relationship, that they start off by taking accountability and responsibility for their own decisions.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Sport has played an essential role in economic growth in Scotland. What steps will he take to ensure the legacy of Sir Andy Murray is recognised in Scotland?
I'm grateful for the question, Mr Speaker. Can I tell the House and announce today that Andy Murray is no relation to myself, despite the fact we share the same physical physique? But I can assure you that the Scotland Office and this Government will do all we can to make sure that wonderful legacy of one of Britain's best sportspersons of all time is certainly maintained.
Torquil Pratchett.
7, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 7, 9 and 10 together. Scotland's at the forefront of this Government's mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower by 2030. We will headquarter Great British Energy, a new publicly owned clean energy company capitalised with £8.3 billion in Scotland. This will help create thousands of jobs, deliver energy security and lower prices permanently for consumers. Just this week, the 6th allocation for the Contracts for Difference scheme was announced, with over 130 renewable projects awarded contracts, with 20% of those projects based in Scotland.
Torquil Pratchett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State to his position? We watched him for many lonely years as he held the fort on his own. He was always outnumbered, he was never outgunned. Can he use the full firepower of the Scotland Office now to convince Cabinet colleagues and industry players of the vital role and potential of the Arnish fabrication yard in Storm And can he assure workers at the Arnish Yard and Stornoway Port that they will play a big role in renewables, future and in GB energy?
Thank you very much for that question. Can I congratulate my honourable friend on winning the Western Isles? He is Mr Western Isles himself, and the Scottish Government to monitor the situation and support a resolution that provides long-term certainty for the yards and workforces across the whole of the UK, with all 4 yards across the UK being treated as one. Minister McNeill has also recently visited the Arnish Yard herself. I visited the Methil Yard twice, once before the election and during the election. In particular, I have regular meetings with the Deputy First Minister on this issue and hope to meet with her again in the coming weeks, but we will do all we can to protect these yards.
Gordon McKay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having spent many years working for the Right Honourable Gentleman when he was on the opposite side of the chamber, can I welcome him to his position as Secretary of State for Scotland. Yeah. The creation of GB Energy will support 50,000 new jobs across Scotland. It will deliver lower household bills and help meet our net zero obligations. Given that Glasgow already has a fantastic renewables industry, can I ask him what work he has done with his Cabinet colleagues to ensure that GB Energy supports jobs in Glasgow?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend and congratulate him for winning his seat in Glasgow South? That's a much better question than he ever wrote for me, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, is due to make an announcement concerning the location of GB Energy very soon. I regret that in the interim I can say no more than that, although I'm sure my honourable friend's words of encouragement in respect of Glasgow will not have escaped the attention of my Cabinet colleagues. And I can announce exclusively to the House today, Mr Speaker, that GB Energy will be headquartered in Scotland.
Richard Baker.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend is aware I've been working closely with Unite GMB and local management at the Methil Yard in my constituency during the restructuring process for Holland and Wolff. Would he agree with me that 200 skilled workers at Methil and those at Arnish have a vital contribution to make to our ambitions to grow our renewable sector, and all stakeholders a vital role in securing the long-term future of these yards?
Can I thank and congratulate my honourable friend for winning Glenrothes in mid-Fife, Mr Speaker. I acknowledge the efforts of my honourable friend and indeed many honourable members in the House and in the local area in respect of the Methil fabrication yard. The yard, along with many others like it, will have a key role in fulfilling our ambition for Scotland and the UK to become a clean energy powerhouse. In addition to GB Energy, the National Wealth Fund will help unlock further investment opportunities for ports, heavy industry and manufacturing companies that have a crucial role to play in creating jobs in our transition to net zero. I've been to the Methil plant twice myself. It's a world-class workforce, and I can assure them we'll do everything we possibly can to make sure they've got a bright future.
John Cooper.
Mr Speaker, thank you. I welcome the Secretary of State to his place and thank him for his generous words about the work of Sir Alistair Jack previously in that role. Does, however, the Right Honourable Gentleman share my consternation this morning that 2 sanctioned Russian oligarchs now have a share in Harbour Energy, our largest producer of North Sea oil and gas? This seems incredible at this time, not least since the company which they are using to have this stake read a letter. We, for our part, forced them to divest themselves of a broadband company because they were a threat to national security. Can we look again at this decision?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman and welcome him to his place, and congratulations on winning his seat. Mr Speaker, the Foreign Secretary is sitting 2 seats along from me. I'm sure he would have heard what he said. I'm sure it's a concern to everyone in the House, and we'll make sure that a written response is given to the honourable gentleman as soon as possible.
Come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Moore.
Mr Speaker, thank you. The Rosebank oil field is going to provide more than £6 billion of investment in UK-based businesses. The Jackdaw oil field will cater for the energy needs of 1.4 million UK households. But this Labour government are jeopardising all that investment, energy and the jobs by dropping the UK government's opposition to the judicial review which aims to block these vital energy projects. Can the Secretary of State seriously tell the 90,000 people whose jobs rely on oil and gas in Scotland that the future of this crucial industry is secure under Labour when it is his government's policy to oppose all new developments?
Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State, and can I firstly say to him that he should stop scaremongering with the 90,000 workforce in the North Sea. Oil and gas will be with us for decades to come. The Finch decision, of course, that he refers to was something that this government had to consider very carefully. The Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, has started a consultation on consenting, which will affect Jackdaw and indeed Rosebank that he has mentioned, and that should conclude within the next 6 months.
John Lamont.
Mr Speaker, question 8.
So what number?
Number 8.
Number 8.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will take questions 8 and 13 together. We will strengthen the Migration Advisory Committee and establish a framework for joint working with skills bodies across the UK, the Industrial Strategy Council and the Department for Work and Pensions. The needs of our economy are different across the regions and nations, and different sectors have different needs. Given that skills policy and employment support are devolved, we will work with the Scottish Government when designing workforce plans for different sectors. This will ensure our migration and skills policies work for every part of the UK.
Mr Speaker, the tourism and hospitality sectors right across my Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber constituency are desperate for people to come and work. But because of Brexit and end of freedom of movement, we have the jobs but we do not have the people. The government know that Scotland needs people. So will the government now reaffirm Jackie Bailey's commitment and assurance to voters and now commit to facilitating the creation of a Scottish visa?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are committed to ensuring that there is effective Scottish representation on the Migration Advisory Council, and I look forward to working with the Home Office and engaging with sectors on ensuring that the immigration sector works for all parts of the UK.
Kirsten Black.
The skilled worker salary threshold and the skills list is simply not working. Will the Minister make sure that the skills occupation list is actually fit for purpose for Scotland, and will she make sure that that skills shortage occupation list works in order for our energy transition to work?
Mr Speaker, it's fixing the foundations of our economy that is the key to bringing long-term prosperity. That includes future-proofing the economy for all, whether that is for long-established families or new arrivals. The Chancellor will set out plans to fix the foundations at the budget on the 30th of October.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. I call Bill Esterson.
Question 1, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I know the whole House will want to congratulate our Team GB Olympic and Paralympic athletes and support staff for their outstanding achievements so far. Mr Speaker, yesterday's incident in the Channel was shocking and deeply tragic, and our thoughts are with all those who've lost their lives and their families. We must have a renewed determination to end this. And Mr Speaker, the chair of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, Sir Martin Morbick, has today published the inquiry's Phase 2 report. And I know that the whole House will be, thoughts of the House will be with the bereaved and the survivors of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and the residents in the immediate community. I will be making a statement shortly after PMQs today. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about the loss of life in the Channel and about Grenfell? The latest suicide figures are a sobering reminder of the misery caused by mental ill health. McGall Health Park in my constituency is a centre of excellence with high, medium and low security hospitals on the same site. The staff do an amazing job, but demand has gone through the roof, especially since the pandemic. Does my right honourable friend agree that it is essential that we have the same level of priority for mental health care and physical health care in this country? Yes, and I thank my honourable friend for raising this critical issue. I think so many are affected by the tragedy of suicide. I'm pleased to hear about the work that he refers to, but 1 million people are not getting the support, the mental health support that they need. And that is why we will recruit 8,500 mental health workers to treat adults and children, and bring forward legislation to modernise the Mental Health Act, an act which I think is well overdue for modernisation. Thank you.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I join with the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the Grenfell community? And we're going to rightly discuss that important issue shortly after PMQs. Can I also join him in congratulating our record-breaking Olympians and Paralympians on everything that they have achieved? And lastly, could I just pay tribute to the hard work, bravery and dedication of our police? this summer in challenging circumstances. They served our communities commendably and kept us all safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, government is about making choices, and the new Prime Minister has made a choice. He has chosen to take the winter fuel allowance away from low-income pensioners and give that money to certain unionised workforces in inflation-busting pay rises. So can I just ask the Prime Minister, why did he choose train drivers over Britain's vulnerable pensioners?
Mr. Speaker, this government was elected to clear up the mess left by the party opposition and to bring about the change that the country desperately needs. Our first job was to audit the books, and what we found was a £22 billion black hole. Well, it's no good them complaining. Richard Hughes, the chair of the OBR, was very clear. He described it as one of the largest year-over overspends against forecast outside of the pandemic. His words. So we've had to take tough decisions to stabilise the economy and repair the damage, including targeting winter fuel payments whilst protecting pensioners. 800,000 pensioners are not taking up pension credit. We intend to turn that around. We're going to align housing benefit and pension credit, something the previous government deferred year after year after year. And because of our commitment to the triple lock, pensions are projected to increase by over £1,000 in the next 5 years.
Rishi Sunak.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also inherited inflation back at target, interest rates being cut, unemployment low, and indeed the fastest growing economy in the G7, Mr. Speaker. But that's not the point, because the Prime Minister now has to start taking responsibility for his own decision. And if, as he says, the public finances are a priority, it was his decision, and his decision alone, to award a train driver on £65,000 a pay rise of almost £10,000. And it was also his decision that a pensioner living on just £13,000 will have their winter fuel allowance removed. So can the Prime Minister explain to Britain's low-income pensioners why he has taken money away from them whilst at the same time given more money to highly paid train drivers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we spent the whole election with him trying to tell the country that everything was fine, and this is the result they got. A massive mandate on this side to change the country. And if he carries on pretending everything is fine for ordinary people across the country, they're going to be there for a very, very long time. And I remind him that we inherited absolute chaos from the party opposite. We lost an average of 3 million working days a year to strikes under his watch. And you cannot fix the economy if the trains don't work, and you can't fix the economy if the NHS isn't working. And when it comes to winter fuel payments, they're having a competition, as I understand. They're going to be voting later on today. Well, his shadow housing minister, we found this. She's the favourite, I think. Some of them will be probably voting for her this afternoon. She said, her words, "I have people in my constituency telling me they don't need winter fuel payments. Why do we not have a more sophisticated mechanism for mean testing?" That's their favourite, I think, in the contest that they are having.
Mr. Speaker, again, the Prime Minister talked about the public finances. The UK's public finances are more robust than almost that of any other major advanced economy. Here we have it. He inherited a lower deficit than France, America, Italy.
Order. When I do point you to be quiet, I do mean it. I don't need a reaction back like that. Rishi.
Well, the UK currently has a lower deficit than France, America, Italy and Japan. It has the second lowest debt in the entire G7. And he opposed every difficult decision that we took to deliver that. So I certainly am not going to take any lectures from him on that, Scott. But he talked about protecting ordinary people. Well, last year, under the Conservative government, a low-income pensioner with just £13,000 received not only the winter fuel payment, but also hundreds of pounds of additional cost of living support, both of which he has now scrapped. Age UK have said cutting the winter fuel allowance is the wrong policy. And only this morning, we've learned that the vast majority of the poorest pensioners, pensioners in poverty, are going to see that vital support removed. So can he tell the House, very specifically to the pensioners that are watching, how much less support a pensioner on £13,000 will receive this winter?
He talks about tough decisions. It's tough to inherit tough £22 billion black hole, which the OBR did not need. That is the inheritance. That's what they left. Now, back when they were in government, they'd have pretended it wasn't there. They'd have walked past it, put it in the long grass. We're not going to do that because we were elected to change this country for the better and stabilise our economy. No Prime Minister wants to do what we have to do in relation to the winter fuel allowance, but we have to take the tough decision to stabilise our economy to ensure that we can grow it for the future. And as I've said, we are working hard on pension credit. We're allowing housing benefits, which they didn't do for years, and over 5 years, it's a projected increase of up to £1,000 for those on pensions. We are tough decisions that they done.
The government doesn't have to choose to take money off low-income pensioners in order to give it to highly paid train drivers. That is a choice that he has made, and it will be clear to any pensioners watching that he simply can't explain why he has made that choice. But, Mr. Speaker, turning to another important issue, the government has suspended 30 of the UK's 350 arms export licences to Israel. It's a decision that the Chief Rabbi says beggars belief and will encourage our shared enemies. Can the Prime Minister therefore explain how his decision will help to secure the release of the 101 hostages still being held by Hamas?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by saying I think the whole House will be shocked by the horrific killing of 6 hostages in the last few days. And I know I speak for the whole House when I say that. The remaining hostages must be released, and we need a ceasefire to ensure that that can happen, that aid desperately needed can get into the region, and we can begin the path to a two-state solution. Now, he asks how we arrived at this decision. He knows very well, because the legal framework is clear. The latest guidance was issued in 2021 under his government, and that means that licences have to be kept under review, as they were by his government. And I think he probably knows the advice that was given to his government. He understands the framework. We've carried out the review in the same way and come to a clear legal conclusion, and shared that conclusion, the assessment, with Parliament. We will, of course, continue to stand by Israel's right to self-defence, but it is important that we are a country committed to the international rule of law. That gives us the strength of argument with our allies on important issues. This is a difficult issue, I recognise that, but it's a legal decision, not a policy decision. And the Prime Minister knows the framework, and they issued the guidance, they know what the test is, that test has been assessed, we've come to a conclusion, and we've put that before the House to consider.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Prime Minister's answer, but he'll know that decisions like this also have important and broader geopolitical implications. And he mentioned allies. It's essential that we maintain transatlantic unity in the face of terrorist threats and avoid any perception of splits between our two nations. So can he therefore update the House or tell the House what engagement he had with the United States prior to taking this significant decision?
Prime Minister.
I acknowledge the importance of working with our allies on all issues, as we have been doing, as I was able to make very clear at the NATO summit that I attended in the early summer. And of course, as he would expect, as the House would expect, we have talked this through with our allies. They understand. They have a different legal system. That is the point they made. It chunters from the start. This is a serious issue. It requires serious consideration. And the Prime Minister knows the legal framework. He knows the legal framework very well. He also knows that applying that framework at the facts of that framework and arriving at a decision does not permit me to simply then say I'm not going to implement the legal decision and conclusion that's been reached. I don't think he's really inviting me to do that.
Mr. Speaker, not only do these decisions have geopolitical consequences, but they also have emotional ones too. And the Prime Minister took this action on the very same day as the funerals of Israeli hostages murdered by Hamas. It's something that the Board of Deputies described as a terrible, terrible message to be sending. And I hope the Prime Minister understands the hurt that has been caused, and can he take this opportunity to reassure Israel and the Jewish community that the United Kingdom and this House stands behind Israel and its right to self-defence.
Prime Minister.
Let me be very clear about that. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We absolutely recognise and support Israel's right to self-defence and have taken action in support of that right of self-defence. And I've made that repeatedly clear in all of my engagements with Israel across the region and with all of our allies. I absolutely stand by that. But in relation to licences, this isn't an Israel issue. It's the framework for all licences that have to be kept under review. It's the same test for all licences, as the Prime Minister knows. And having applied the law to the facts and come to a legal conclusion, I don't think the Prime Minister is really inviting me to put that to one side. We have to, the Leader of the Opposition. This is a serious issue. We either comply with international law or we don't. And we only have strength in our arguments because we comply with international law. I appreciate the party opposite didn't think that international law mattered, and that's why we got into the pickle that we did.
Lord Hatton. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Home Office's decision to close the Bibby Stockholm barge in my constituency. We all know this barge is a gimmick. First, it arrived late. Second, it cost the taxpayer a fortune. Third, it was laden with fire and disease risks. And fourth, it likely contributed to the death of a 27-year-old asylum seeker on board. So can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that this unworkable gimmick and similar unworkable gimmicks will be closed down as we clear up the mess from the party opposite?
I thank my honourable friend for the question. Unlike the party opposite, we won't waste money on gimmicks. And that's why within days we ended the Rwanda scheme, we announced the launch of the Border Security Force, and we're preparing legislation to introduce counter-terrorism powers to tackle gangs. And in the first 2 months, we've removed more than 400 people on planes who had no right to be here. Compare that with the 4 volunteers sent to Rwanda that cost £700 million. This is a government of service, not a government of gimmicks.
Here comes the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Trev Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the Prime Minister's words about the terrible tragedy at Grenfell, welcome the inquiry and look forward to the statement we'll discuss shortly. Mr. Speaker, for the last 18 years, Norman has been a full-time carer for his wife, Ros, who has MS and Alzheimer's disease. Earlier this year, he was forced to go back to work to earn the extra money for the cost of caring for his wife. As their income is just a few £100s above the limit for pension credit, they're set to lose their winter fuel allowance unless the Prime Minister listens to these benches and others and changes this plan. So, if he doesn't, what advice does the Prime Minister have to Norman and Ros and millions of struggling pensioners as they face rising heating bills this winter?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable member for raising that important question. I know how much he, both politically and personally, has championed carers. We have taken a difficult decision, and I'm not pretending it's not a difficult decision. Of course it's a difficult decision, because we have to stabilise the economy. We have to stabilise the economy. We went through, the first thing the Chancellor did was an audit. She found £22 billion worth of unfunded spending commitments. We can't walk past that. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. That's what the last government did. We have to take tough decisions. We will put all the support in that we can, obviously talk to the learned gentleman about this, but we have to take the tough decisions in relation to this. They walked away from those decisions. That's what got us into the mess in the first place. You can't grow your economy, you can't fix your economy unless you stabilise it first.
Ed Davey. Can I say to the Prime Minister, we recognise the appalling financial problems left to him by the last Conservative government, but can I say no one understands the difficult decisions you need to take to balance the books as unpaid family carers like Norman. So many millions of pensioners have struggled over recent years thanks to the last government. The number of pensioners who can't afford to heat their homes has doubled since 2019. So will the Prime Minister support our campaign for more urgent action to invest in insulation and renewables so we can help pensioners and all families make it cheaper to heat their homes every winter?
Yes, of course. And I remind him that there are 800,000 pensioners who are not claiming pension credit, which of course then deals with the winter payment allowance. And so that's why we are taking so much care to ensure that we can get them onto pension credit. Again, aligning housing benefit with pension credit, something they left undone for years, will make a massive difference. And of course the triple lock, which over 5 years will mean pensions are expected to rise by up to £1,000.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, the previous government ordered a review into the hormone pregnancy test drug Primidose and found that the drug had caused avoidable harm. Primidose was given to women in the 1960s and the 70s and resulted in many babies being born with severe disabilities. For the last 12 years, I have stood in this Parliament and pleaded with the last government repeatedly to do the right thing. So I ask the Prime Minister today, will he commit to take a fresh approach to this issue, and will he meet with me and the campaigner Marie Lyon to discuss how we can give closure to the families who have been denied justice for the last 50 years?
Well, I thank her for that question and for her work on the APPG. I am sympathetic to the families who believe their children suffered from these tests and committed to reviewing any new evidence which comes to light. Mr. Speaker, at the moment the Health Department is reviewing a publication from Professor Danielson and we'll follow the results of that review. And I'm happy to ensure that the Health Minister does meet her to discuss this further.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for visiting Northern Ireland within the last fortnight, and particularly for the time he spent with injured officers of the police service of Northern Ireland. He will know of their courage, but he will also know of the dogged determination of our Chief Constable John Boucher in his desire to see adequate resourcing for his officers who not only stand for law and order in Northern Ireland, but stand in the face of racism, of violence and of an ongoing national security threat from dissident Republicans. So can I therefore ask him to earnestly and urgently engage in a discussion about uplifting the national security grant afforded to the Police Service of Northern Ireland and ensure that the PSNI can face the challenges that we need them to face head on?
Well, I thank him for that question, and it was important for me to go to Belfast to meet the injured officers and to say simply thank you for what they are doing and, of course, the impact it has on their families. I do recognise the difficult financial position the PSNI faces, and the Chief Constable and I have spoken about this on more than one occasion, as you would expect. I mean, predominantly it's for the Justice Minister and the Executive to set the PSNI's budget, and an operational matter for the Chief Constable in relation to how he allocates that. But I have been talking to him about what further support might be possible, because I do realise just how important it is to him and to the PSNI and to Northern Ireland more generally.
Emma Foodie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, ticket-selling websites like Ticketmaster left millions of Oasis fans furious. But worse still came minutes later when tickets started to be relisted online for thousands of pounds. This profiteering at fans' expense is not a one-off. The cooperative party's campaigning for a new licensing body with real teeth to tackle this online touting? Does the Prime Minister agree with me that fans should be at the heart of live music and that urgent action is needed to protect fans against this horrid practice?
Prime Minister. Yes, I do. And firstly, it's great that OSs are back together. I think, from what I've determined, about half the country is probably queuing for tickets over the weekend. But it is depressing to hear of price hikes. I'm committed to putting fans at the heart of music and end extortionate price resales, and we're starting a consultation to work out how best we can do this.
Harriet Cross.
Mr. Speaker, Offshore Energies UK reports that the government's proposed windfall tax increases will cost our economy £13 billion, risk 35,000 jobs and see investment in the North Sea slashed from £14.1 billion to just £2.3 billion by 2029. It also suggests that there's going to be a £12 billion cost in tax revenues. How does this proposal chime with the Prime Minister's goal of economic growth? And will he reverse this tax increase, which industry leaders are calling economic suicide for the oil and gas sector?
Mr. Speaker, we're committed to the transition that is necessary in relation to energy to renewables, which will lead to cheaper energy, energy independence and the jobs of the future. But let me be clear, oil and gas will play its part for many years to come, and that's why we've been really clear about the support that we have for oil and gas. And I'm sure she and others will want to celebrate the fact that just this week, Contracts for Difference secured a record 131 new clean energy projects, enough to power 11 million homes, and that is the jobs of the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will remember visiting my constituency in June, where we toured Germany Beck, a fantastic development of 600 new homes. But because of Tory dither and delay, it took the best part of a decade for that site to get through planning. You can grumble all you want, but my families are paying the price for their mistakes. Can the Prime Minister reassure me that this government will speed up the planning process so we can get more homes built, and will one of his ministers meet with me to discuss the housing crisis in York?
Yes, I remember that visit well, and was struck by the delays in planning because the system was broken by the previous government. We will deliver 1.5 million new homes, Mr. Speaker, drive economic growth and fulfil the dream of home ownership, shattered for 14 years under the former government. And that means changing the planning rules, a tough decision they were not prepared to make that happen and to grow our economy. Thank you.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, SSE, the operators of the new Viking Energy wind farm in Shetland, were paid £2 million in order not to generate any electricity from it. Is there not something badly wrong with an energy market that pays big corporates not to produce electricity, while the people living amongst the turbines endure some of the highest levels of fuel poverty in the country? So will the Prime Minister and the Government now look seriously at the idea of an islands tariff, so that islands communities such as those represented by me and by his honourable friend from the Helen and the Near may see some genuine benefit for the community from hosting renewable energy developments such as this?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for raising this issue, which is obviously a considerable concern to him and his constituents. The National Grid, as he knows, does balance the grid by occasionally requesting some generators to stop when there's not enough capacity on the network. That's not good enough. That's not acceptable for the reasons set out in his question. It's a problem that wasn't fixed over the last 14 years, but a problem we are determined to fix as we go forward. And I will make sure that a relevant minister speaks to him about the particular issue in his constituency.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. As a surgeon from East Anglia, I welcome the measures the new government has taken to fulfil its mission to fix the NHS. In my constituency of Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket, the West Suffolk Hospital is badly affected by RAC, just like the James Paget Hospital in Norfolk, where I've worked for nearly 30 years. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the RAC hospitals must be priorities? as the new government undertakes its review of the new hospital programme?
I thank him for his question, and also he brings huge expertise to this area. We have to reset the new hospital programme and put it on a sustainable footing. The last government promised 40 new hospitals. The problem is there weren't 40, they weren't new, and some of them weren't even hospitals. Hospitals with RAC will, of course, including West Suffolk Hospital, must be a priority. So we're reviewing the programme, and the Secretary of State will update Parliament as soon as possible.
Shaw. After 14 miserable years of the worst Tory government in modern times, the best this Prime Minister can offer the British people is things can only get worse. Well, for him and his calamitous opinion ratings, that's probably true. But why does he think he has such an unprecedented fall in his popularity? Is it his attacks on the pensioners? Is it leaving children in poverty? Is it the re-emergence of Labour cronyism? Or is it because his austerity is even worse than the Conservative variety?
I remember when they used to sit here. It's a long way up and there's very few of them, so I don't think we need lectures on popularity and non-election.
Yes, MP. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this week's news on the changes, the government plans around Ofsted, including the removal of single-word judgments. This is great news for head teachers in West Lancashire who've raised this issue with me, along with other issues around Ofsted, and for parents who will have more transparency on the performance of schools. How does the Prime Minister see these changes developing a more positive relationship between Ofsted, government and schools, and improving standards so that all our young people can thrive?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're committed to the best education for every child, whatever their background and wherever they come from. The current single grade does not work well, and that's why we're going to have a richer dashboard which will give parents more information and allow intervention more quickly, and that's why it's been so warmly welcomed across the country.
Rebecca Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am new to this House, but I know that we all want our pensioners to live with dignity and security. In my constituency of Reigate, there are around 17,000 pensioners expected to lose their winter fuel payment this year.
Shocking.
Of most concern are those just above the pension credit threshold who will be hardest hit. Would the Prime Minister give consideration to broadening the eligibility for the winter fuel payment so that those low-income pensioners who rely on it to stay warm can continue to benefit?
Can I welcome her to her place? And Reigate is obviously a place I know very well, as she knows. But the reality is this. This decision has been taken because of the £22 billion black hole. So responsibility for the decision lies with the party that broke the economy. There's a reason we have a mandate for change, and there's a reason that this party is now sitting there, and that's because they broke the economy. And I'm not going to apologise for clearing up the mess that they left.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years of Conservative failure, crime and street drinking now blight areas of Southall Town Centre, West Ealing and Hanwell Broadway in my constituency of Ealing Southall. So can the Prime Minister set out how his government will take action to ensure our town centres are transformed into places where my constituency can finally feel safe again?
Thank you. This is an important issue, Mr. Speaker, and I've heard too many people say that antisocial behaviour is some sort of low-level issue. It really impacts lives across the country. We have to tackle it, and that's why we will put more police on the streets. We will have more effective powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, and we'll introduce Young Futures programmes to divert young people who are getting into trouble.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Question number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Schools Minister will be happy to visit his constituency.
Sir Ashley Fox.
I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. Haygrove School is one of the top performing schools in Somerset. It is unfortunately one of those built by Caledonian Modular and now condemned as unsafe. So I'm grateful for the meeting with the Schools Minister. But can the Prime Minister give Haygrove School and the other schools affected an assurance that they will be rebuilt and quickly? Because those pupils and staff are still working in porter cabins.
I'm grateful. I do recognise how serious an issue this is and why he raises it. It is of real importance. The Minister will visit, and the Department of Education is pursuing all available avenues for redress against the parties responsible for the issues at the school. But I will make sure that the Minister is fully briefed and has a full discussion about this when that visit takes place.
Sean Davis.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a proud MP for a new town, but over the last 14 years, Telford has lost its A&E. Less police officers, GPs, teachers per head, and we've also had 40% cuts to our local government budgets. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, back places like Telford rather than overlook us, as has been the case over these last 14 years?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for raising this issue, and I know he'll be a really strong champion for his constituency. We're a government that will be based on actions, not slogans, and that's why we'll have local growth plans, improve public services and invest in transport links. We will fix the mess that they left after 14 years, and we will devolve power to those with skin in the game.
Tim Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 5 years, there have been 10 fatal accidents on the A66 along the short stretch in the Eden Valley in Westmoreland. So in our community, we are naturally deeply concerned that the vital A66 Northern Transpennine project, which would make the roads considerably safer, has been put under review by this government. Will the Prime Minister take the opportunity now and end this uncertainty today, commit to this project and save lives?
I thank him for raising this question about fatalities on roads, and that is a very serious issue in relation to the A66 and other roads across the country. We have inherited a broken economy. We have to review what we're spending money on. We're going through that review and we'll report back as soon as we can.
Gurinder Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in sending condolences to the family of Jadzia Koch, a 13-year-old boy who was stabbed and tragically killed in my constituency? Does the Prime Minister share my concerns about the prevalence of young people carrying knives, and what more can be done to end this scourge that is destroying families and communities?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I speak for the whole House in saying our thoughts are with Jazia's family at this difficult time. This is tragic, it is senseless, and the age just absolutely makes one shudder. Our mission is to halve knife crime. Zombie-style knives and zombie-style machetes will be banned from the 24th of September, and there'll be a surrender scheme which has been started on 26th of August. And we are doing a rapid review on online sale of knives, which is often a problem in these cases. So we will pursue that with determination, and I invite everybody across the House, in light of this and so many other tragic cases, to join with us on that mission.
Final question, Karen Bradley.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Those of us from Staffordshire Moorlands are immensely proud of our beautiful area and unique identity. So can the Prime Minister guarantee that we will not be forced into a devolution deal or local government reorganisation against our will?
I think it's very important that local people have a say, but it's equally important that we do devolve to those who have skin in the game. And one of the ways in which we can restart our economy is making sure that those with skin in the game take the decisions that are relevant to them and their area.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. I'll let those who are leaving the chamber leave quickly before we start the statement. Now come to the statement. I call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, Sir Martin Morbick published the final report of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking him, the members of the inquiry and the whole team for their dedicated work. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak directly to the bereaved families, the survivors and those in the immediate Grenfell community, some of whom are with us in the gallery today. Sir Martin concluded this morning, and I'm afraid there's no way of repeating this that won't be painful. He said the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and that those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by, as the report lays out in full, just about every institution responsible for ensuring their safety. Mr. Speaker, in the face of an injustice so painful, so deserving of anger, words can begin to lose their meaning. 7 years still waiting for the justice that you deserve. I want to say very clearly on behalf of the country, you've been let down so badly before, during and in the aftermath of this tragedy. And while Sir Martin sets out a catalogue of appalling industry failures for which there must now be full accountability, he also finds, and I quote, decades of failure by central government. He concludes that in the years between the fire at Knowsley Heights in 1991 and the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017, there were many opportunities for the government to identify the risks posed by the use of combustible cladding panels and insulation. And he concludes, and I quote, by 2016, the department was well aware of those risks, but failed to act on what they knew. He further finds that the department itself was poorly run, and the government's deregulatory agenda dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones, the people that we are here to serve, and I am deeply sorry. I also want to express my admiration for the strength it must have taken to relive these events when giving your evidence to the inquiry, and indeed to see written down today the circumstances that led to the death of your loved ones. After all you've been through, you may feel you're always one step away from another betrayal. I get that, and I know I cannot change that with just words today. But what I can say is I listened carefully to one of the members of the inquiry, Ali Akbar, this morning, who said this: what is needed is for those with responsibility for building safety to reflect and to treat Grenfell as a touchstone in all that they do in the future. Mr. Speaker, I consider myself someone responsible for building safety, and that is exactly what I will do and what I'll demand of this government. Mr. Speaker, today is a long-awaited day of truth, but it must now lead to a day of justice. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell, but also a moment to reflect on the state of social justice in our country, and a chance for this government of service to turn the page. Because this tragedy poses fundamental questions about the kind of country we are, a country where the voices of working class people and those of colour have been repeatedly ignored and dismissed. a country where tenants of a social housing block in one of the richest parts of the land are treated like second-class citizens, shamefully dismissed, in the words of one survivor, as people with needs and problems, not respected as citizens, as people who contribute to Britain, who are part of Britain, who belong in Britain. And Mr. Speaker, unbelievably, this continued even after the tragedy. Sir Martin highlights, and I quote, certain aspects of the response demonstrated a marked lack of respect for human decency and dignity, and left many of those immediately affected feeling abandoned by authority and utterly helpless. Mr. Speaker, that alone should make anyone who feels any affinity towards justice bristle with anger. But Sir Martin continues. He finds, and these are his words, Mr. Speaker, systematic dishonesty on the part of those who made and sold the rain screen cladding panels and insulation products. And he goes on to say, they engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. Sir Martin also cites a complete failure on the part of the local authority building control over a number of years to take basic steps to ensure that the certificates it issued were technically accurate. He finds that the work of the building research establishment was marred by unprofessional conduct, inadequate practices, a lack of effective oversight, poor reporting, and a lack of scientific rigour, and that the tenant management organisation must bear a share of the blame. Its only fire safety assessor, these are his words, had misrepresented his experience and qualifications, some of which he invented, and was ill-informed to carry out fire risk assessments on buildings of the size and complexity of Grenfell Tower. He also finds a chronic lack of effective management and leadership on behalf of the London Fire Brigade, with tragic consequences on the night of the fire. Mr. Speaker, in the light of such findings, it is imperative that there is full accountability, including through the criminal justice process, and that this happens as swiftly as possible. So I can tell the House today that this government will write to all companies found by the inquiry to be part of these horrific failings as the first step to stopping them being awarded government contracts. And we will, of course, support the Metropolitan Police and the prosecutors as they complete their investigations. But, Mr. Speaker, it is vital that as we respond to this report today, we do not do or say anything that could compromise any future prosecution, because the greatest injustice of all would be for the victims and all those affected not to get the justice that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, there must also be more radical action to stop something like this from ever happening again, because one of the most extraordinary qualities of the Grenfell community is their determination to look forward. They are not only fighting for justice for themselves, they are fighting to ensure that no other community suffers as they have done. Mr. Speaker, some important reforms have taken place in the last 7 years, reforms that we supported in opposition, including banning combustible cladding, new oversight of building control, a new safety regime for all residential buildings over 18 metres, new legal requirements on social landlords, making sure fire and rescue services are trained and equipped to handle large-scale incidents, including moving from stay put to get out when needed. And we're now addressing the recommendation from Sir Martin's first report to introduce a new residential personal emergency evacuation plan policy for anyone whose ability to evacuate could be compromised, and funding from this from renting in social housing. Mr. Speaker, we will look at all 58 of Sir Martin's recommendations in detail. There will be a debate on the floor of this House. We will respond in full to the inquiry's recommendations within 6 months, and we will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make. But there are some things I can say right now. There are still buildings today with unsafe cladding, and the speed at which this is being addressed is far, far too slow. We only have to look at the fire in Dagenham last week, a building that was still in the process of having its cladding removed. So this must be a moment of change. We'll take the necessary steps to speed this up. We will be willing to force freeholders to assess their buildings and enter remediation schemes within set timetables, with a legal requirement to force action if that is what it takes. And we will set out further steps on remediation this autumn. We will also reform the construction products industry that make this fatal cladding so homes are made of safe materials. And those who compromise that safety will face the consequences. We will ensure that tenants and their leaseholders can never again be ignored, and that social landlords are held to account for the decency and safety of their homes. And as this government tackles the most acute housing crisis in living memory, building 1.5 million new homes across the country, we will ensure those homes are safe, secure, and built to the highest standards. Places of security, health and well-being that serve the needs of residents and their wider communities. Because a safe and decent home is a human right and a basic expectation, and the provision of that right should never be undermined by the reckless pursuit of greed. One of the tragedies of Grenfell is that this is a community that nurtured so much of what we want from housing. People who had made the tower their home and were entitled to a place of safety and security, not a death trap. And yet, time and again, they were ignored. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I made a private visit to Grenfell Tower and laid a wreath at the memorial wall, and affirmed this government's commitment to the work of the Memorial Commission, delivering a permanent memorial on the site through a process led by the Grenfell community. As I walked down that narrow staircase from the 23rd floor and looked at walls burned by 1,000-degree heat, I got just a sense of how utterly, utterly terrifying it must have been. And as I saw examples of the cladding on the outside of the building and listened to descriptions of the catastrophic and completely avoidable failures of that fatal refurbishment, I felt just a sense of the anger that now rises through that building. And it left me, Mr. Speaker, with the profound and very personal determination to make the legacy of Grenfell Tower one of the defining changes to our country that I want to make as Prime Minister. To the families, the survivors and the immediate community, we will support you now and always, especially those that were children. In the memory of your loved ones, we will deliver a generational shift in the safety and quality of housing for everyone in this country. And in the memory of Grenfell, we will change our country, not just a change in policy and regulation, although that must of course take place, but a profound shift in culture and behaviour. A rebalancing of power that gives voice and respect to every citizen, whoever they are and wherever they live. And Mr. Speaker, we will bring the full power of government to bear on this task, because that is the responsibility of service and the duty we owe to the memory of every one of the 72. And in that spirit, I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, especially giving the timing of Prime Minister's question time. And can I also associate myself and everyone on this side of the House with the Prime Minister's powerful words regarding the pain of the bereaved families, survivors, and all those affected by the tragic events surrounding Grenfell Tower. Many are with us today in the gallery, and I want to pay tribute to their strength and patience in waiting for this moment. It is not hyperbole to say that we would not be here today without them. It was their tenacity and strength that brought the truth to light, and for that they deserve our thanks. Their search for truth and justice is a noble one and has our full support. And whilst the Grenfell community's loss will have left a hole nothing will ever be able to fill, I hope that whatever healing is possible from today, that each and every one of them take some small measure of it. I know they will never forget the 72 people who tragically lost their lives, and nor shall we. Today's publication, as the Prime Minister said, is, to put it bluntly, a damning indictment of over 30 years of successive state failures. Stretching as far back as Knowsley Heights in 1991 and then multiple incidents from there, Sir Martin Morbick and the work of the inquiry have painted a picture of systemic indifference, failure, and in some notable cases, dishonesty and greed. Sir Martin and the team working on the inquiry are to be commended for the depth and rigour of their work. And Mr. Speaker, while such a comprehensive report as has been published today deserves to be considered in full, and I welcome the Prime Minister's commitments for time in this House to do that, there are some immediate points that I feel will command support across the House and that I'll address to the Prime Minister. First, the work to remediate and, where possible, identify new at-risk buildings must continue if we are to meet, as I'm confident the whole House would agree, the Right Honourable former member for Maidenhead's pledge that no such tragedy could occur again. I know this task is not a simple one, and I thank the Prime Minister for recognising the importance of this issue. A significant barrier to making progress quicker is financial liability. It was an issue I was all too aware of when I became Chancellor, and why one of the first major spending decisions I made was the creation of a new £1 billion fund to pay for remediation works in public and private buildings affected by materials beyond dangerous ACM cladding. And the previous government's cladding safety scheme has ensured an additional £5.1 billion is available to support remediation work, coming from a combination of a developer contribution and a building safety levy. So I'd ask the Prime Minister and Chancellor to give due consideration to any further requests, especially with the upcoming fiscal event towards the end of October. The second point I'm confident that the Prime Minister would agree on is the need to maintain and update our legal and regulatory framework to keep pace with changes in materials, construction and supply. The last Parliament passed the Fire Safety Act in 2021, but also the Building Safety Act in 2022. And I acknowledge, as the Prime Minister said, that he worked constructively with the then government to deliver those improvements. These pieces of legislation comprehensively reformed our fire safety and building regulation regimes and ensured that a new building safety regulator was created, located in the Health and Safety Executive. But I also know that these are stepping stones towards a fire and building safety regime that remains persistently fit for purpose. And in particular, I'd urge the Prime Minister to give special attention to the recommendations in today's report, especially its call for more regular updating of approved Document B, a single regulator, a sole Secretary of State responsible to end the fragmentation of Whitehall responsibilities, and a new Chief Construction Advisor. And I want the Prime Minister to know that should he deem further legislation to support proportionate and necessary measures to protect the public, whilst protecting leaseholders from excessive costs is required, then we will work collegiately with him to deliver that. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, allied to the need for continued improvement in the legal and regulatory frameworks, this report also shines a light on the significant failures of oversight. Those responsible for ensuring the independence and rigour of testing and compliance were found by this report to have had those very things compromised. In particular, the BRE, in its work with suppliers, in part enabled what Sir Martin Morbick's report has plainly described as systemically dishonest behaviour on the part of suppliers. So I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to continue to support the Metropolitan Police and Crown Prosecution Service in pursuing any appropriate criminal charges against a small number of developers and contractors who knowingly and fraudulently cut corners on building safety for greed and financial gain. And Mr. Speaker, I don't want to let this moment pass without also acknowledging the local failures today's report highlights, whether from the tenant management organisation responsible for the building itself, who allowed relationships with those living in Grenfell Tower to become so broken that tenants were marginalised and at worst ignored, the repeated fire safety reports that were not acted on, the lack of effective management and leadership at London Fire Brigade, and the local council, who had a lack of adequate oversight into the management and maintenance of the building and the cares and concerns of those living in it. Mr. Speaker, there will be further lessons to learn from this inquiry. There will be difficult questions for all those responsible, acting over a long period of time. And I know that the Prime Minister will agree that we must approach those questions with the honesty and directness with which they deserve. And let me conclude, Mr. Speaker. At the time, the former Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead apologised to the victims for what she described as failures at a local and national level in response to the fire. I share in those same words still. I think today, however, demands more. As a Prime Minister, current or former, you are a custodian of the state. And its failures, whether on your watch or not, are something that you feel deeply. And to that end, I want to extend my deepest apologies to the families and victims of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. The state let you down, and it must never do so again. Mr. Speaker, the mission to ensure no such tragedy can ever happen again is one I know the whole House supports. But more than that, it is part of a legacy we must create and maintain so that our actions meet the full meaning of our words.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank him for the tone and the substance of his response. We do owe it to the victims, their families and the community to work together to ensure that they can get the justice that they deserve and that we make this a turning point that means that this will never happen again. There will be a debate for the whole House to participate because I know there will be an opportunity to ask questions today, but members and honourable members will want to make substantive contributions on this tragic issue, but also, no doubt, issues of concern in their own constituencies in relation to cladding and fire safety. So we'll make sure that time is available. I welcome his approach to working jointly, as we were able to do in opposition ourselves, particularly on the remediation work, which is behind schedule, needs to speed up, and we need to do all we can on that. On the financial liability, this is obviously an issue, and we'll look across to the sufficiency of that. On the legal and regulatory framework, obviously changes have been made already. I do think further changes are going to be necessary. We'll share that with the opposition as soon as we've got some realistic proposals to put before the House, and I think if we can then join together in passing the necessary legislation as quickly as possible, that will be a mark of our determination to treat this as a turning point. And I share in his comments about criminal proceedings. Clearly we don't want to prejudice those criminal proceedings, but I don't think anybody could read this report and not be absolutely shocked at the description of some of the dishonesty. This was not just incompetence, it was dishonesty, manipulating of tests and the market. And you can't read that on the page of this report and not have a renewed determination to ensure that justice is delivered for those who deserve that justice. Thank you.
Can I just say I thank the Prime Minister for his comments about the need for caution in terms of comments relating to particular legal cases or inquest. I repeat the waiver that I granted under the sub judice rule on the 21st of June 2022. So I appeal to all members to absolutely to speak, but be cautious of what we do. I now come to the middle of the House, Diane Abbott.
Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister aware of how painful it must be for the Grenfell community to have that tower looming over them for 7 years, and for it to have taken 7 years to even reach this stage? Having visited Grenfell, he will be aware that the majority of the 72 that died were amongst the most marginalised and largely people of migrant heritage. Can he give an assurance that the bereaved will get all of the support they need going forward, including financial support? And can he also give an assurance that it will not take 7 years to bring those responsible to justice?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and she's absolutely right to focus on the community, on the bereaved, and decisions such as the tower, the memorial, whatever it may be, must be taken
in consultation with the community, and I give that absolute commitment here that we will do that in addition to the support that they need, because visiting, I got a sense, but a small sense, of course, myself, as to just how painful this must have been and continues to be, and we cannot allow another 7 years to pass before we take the necessary action.
We come to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for his extremely powerful comments today and associate my party with them all. The Grenfell disaster is a tragedy that shames our whole society. The report lays bare failings of governments of all parties over decades, and on behalf of my party, I am sorry. We must all learn from it and do everything we can to change the system to prevent more horrifying tragedies like this in the future. So it's right we pause today and remember the 72 people who lost their lives, as well as the survivors and the bereaved families and friends who fought so long and so hard for justice. This is their day. They waited far too long to get to this truth, and many will remain frustrated that even after today they'll still be waiting for justice and meaningful action. So I want to raise 3 issues of the many that the families raise. First, to get the justice that the families crave, criminality must be investigated, tried and punished, whether it's corporate manslaughter, fraud or misconduct in public office. So will the Prime Minister confirm the police, prosecutors and courts will have all the resources they need to bring those responsible swiftly to justice? Second, what more can the Prime Minister do, can we all do for greater urgency to act on all these recommendations so this report doesn't just gather dust on a Whitehall shelf? Even now, 7 years on, essential work to make more than 2,300 buildings safe hasn't even started. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what more will be done to remove dangerous cladding as quickly as possible, forcing those responsible to pay, not the tenants and leaseholders? And finally, we must tackle the big systemic issues that come up time and again in scandals like this, from Hillsborough to Horizon to Infected Blood. Like other scandals victims, the bereaved and survivors of Grenfell have called for a duty of candour on public officials, and we welcomed its inclusion in the King's speech. So can the Prime Minister tell us when that legislation will be published and whether the duty will cover all public officials?
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for his response and join with him on this sense that this has taken too long and it's been too hard, and it's not unique in that respect in relation to these types of injustices. On the specific points he makes, it is really important that criminality is fully investigated, and we will give all support and resource that's necessary to the relevant authorities. In relation to the recommendations, we will respond as quickly as possible within 6 months. It's a long report. There are many recommendations, and I think it's right that we take time to look through them, to consider how they can be complied with, and then come back to the House in relation to that, and then come back on an annual basis to assess the progress that we are making and to be held to account on it. On the removal of cladding, that does need to be speeded up. There's no question about that, and measures are already being taken in relation to that. And on Hillsborough, that was in the King's speech. This duty of candour is very, very important, and we'll look again at it in light of this report, but we're determined to bring forward that legislation as quickly as we can. It's long overdue, but I do think, having looked at some of the report already, that it's worth reflecting and making sure what's in the report is incorporated into whatever law that we do bring forward. Thank you.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've heard, it's now over 7 years since 72 people lost their lives at Grenfell Tower in North Kensington. And as we heard again today, it was entirely foreseen, entirely preventable, the result of individuals and organisations that were systematically dishonest and put profit before people's lives. And I want to pay tribute to the next of kin, bereaved and survivors, including those who are here today, for their resilience and strength. This is a very painful day for the community. Prime Minister, The shameless merry-go-round of buck passing that has happened for the last 7 years since Grenfell must now come to an end. So I want to thank you for your personal commitment to drive the lasting change and to hold people accountable. Can you assure me that the government will now do everything in its power to ensure that criminal prosecutions will take place as soon as possible? Can he commit to ensuring that companies identified in this report will be excluded from public contracts, held account to the full extent of the law, and pay their full weight of financial remediation for the building safety remedial work that's needed? And can he ensure that the Phase 2 recommendations for central government will be a blueprint for real change, and that implementation of those will be swift and as comprehensive as possible, so that we can really say a tragedy like Grenfell will not happen again?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, and I can confirm that we will do everything to make sure there is full accountability, including criminal accountability where appropriate. I do remind the House, as Mr Speaker you have, that notwithstanding the strong findings in the report, it is the last thing now that the victims, the bereaved and the community want or need is for anything to go wrong with possible legal proceedings. So we must all bear that in mind, but I absolutely understand the sentiment. And in relation to the contracts, I stand by what I said in my statement. And I would just concur with the honourable friend on the resilience and strength of the victims, the families, the survivors and the community. It must have been really hard to give evidence to this inquiry. And it must be really hard to read the details in this long report of what happened, and even harder still to read the conclusions in relation to the failures and the dishonesty. And so we must pay respect to that resilience and strength.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And very sadly for most of us, this report is not a surprise, because many of the things that were being said over many years have now come to fruition in these recommendations. As the Prime Minister has quite rightly alluded to, the conspiracy on testing of products is clearly going to be something that must be subject to criminal proceedings. Will he therefore look at some of the recommendations immediately that affect the government, namely bringing responsibility under one department, with one minister being responsible and answerable to this House, to make sure that action is taken? And secondly, ensuring that one single regulator is introduced to make sure that these various different aspects that were clearly wrong do not occur again.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. I think it is really important. We will report back on all of the recommendations within 6 months, but if we can act more quickly in relation to some of them, then we will do that straight away. So the 6 months is to report back, but within that, if there are recommendations which we can accept and move forward, we will do that rather than waiting for the 6 month period, because I think it's very important for all the reasons that he just so powerfully put.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on the community in North Ken, which is also my community in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, not only for the survivors and families of victims, but for all of those in West London. Grenfell Tower is a daily presence in our lives, in particular for those who live in the many high-rise buildings surrounding Grenfell. So will the Prime Minister ensure that all housing is built safe and made safe from the risk of fire, which his predecessors failed to do? And above all today, will he pledge that those complicit in the Grenfell fire are brought to justice, so there's no mistake as to their guilt or their punishment?
Prime Minister.
It is important there's full accountability, and that where appropriate people are brought to justice. That is the least that the families, the survivors, the bereaved and the community deserve. And I absolutely understand the point he makes about the wider community. This has impacted the wider community, of course. It has, and he well knows that in his own work as the constituency MP. I saw a bit of that when I visited. There's various writings on the wall around the memorial where people have recorded their private views from the area. it is an important read for anybody who wants to be in a position of leadership.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and also Sir Martin Warbeck. But could I refer him specifically to recommendation 113.58? After Piper Alpha, there was established an independent offshore safety investigation body. After the Paddington rail crash, we established the Independent Rail Accident Investigation Board. A former Fire and Housing Minister, Nick Rainsford, a former Chief Investigator of the AAIB, Keith Conradi, and a leading building control specialist, and I made a submission to the inquiry recommending that there should be independent incident investigation of serious building failures of this nature, which would be able to conduct an investigation far more quickly than a public inquiry and with accumulated expertise. And yet this role is left with the London Fire Brigade, which is itself heavily criticised and would therefore be conflicted in any investigation of a similar incident, which is why they weren't put in charge of investigating this incident in the first place. Could we come and see him about this very, very serious matter?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for raising what is a really serious issue. We will, of course, look at that recommendation. We'll report to the House, and I'll make sure that a meeting is set up for him to be able to input directly into our considerations on that particular recommendation and any others that he has concerns about.
Florence Session-Lerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today, first and foremost, is about the families of Grenfell and the 72 people who died. For them, today is another emotionally exhausting day. But we must remember that their fight is our fight in that fight for justice. And Mr. Speaker, Grenfell laid bare the truth, the sad truth, around the stigma attached to social housing. It's a stigma I still remember when people made assumptions because I lived on a council estate. It's the stigma attached to people who are actually from all walks of life, teachers, doctors, firefighters, people who pay their rent on time but yet are treated with that disdain by housing providers. And this Starmer report confirms that. It talks about stating that their voices were ignored and the safety in industries was ignored, delayed or disregarded at all levels of the government and housing sector. This is unforgivable. The Prime Minister has spoken about that culture. Will he commit to ensuring that this new government addresses that culture within our housing sector, which often treats social housing tenants as an afterthought?
Minister.
She speaks very powerfully about a really important point in relation to social housing, and the report is littered with examples of disrespect, of people not being listened to, not being taken seriously. And yes, policy and regulation are in part the answer to this, but policy and regulation on their own are not the complete answer to this. There has to be that change in culture and behaviour. And turning a corner needs to mean something more than passing a new law or putting in place new guidance, much needed though that is. It means all of us adopting a different culture and behaviour, because otherwise we will be back here in I don't know how many years having the same debate again, and we cannot visit that on the victims, survivors, deceased and the communities of Grenfell.
Stephen.
Mr. Speaker, our hearts ache at the injustice and horror which befell individuals and their families at Grenfell Tower, and I would like to commend the Prime Minister for the strength and power of his remarks from the dispatch box today. Can he give a commitment that his government will continue to work constructively with the devolved governments to ensure the quick removal of all cladding right across these isles so that we don't see a repeat of this horrible tragedy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, and it's a really important point. It doesn't matter where you live, whatever the government that you're living under, the right to safe and secure housing is important, whoever you are, wherever you are. The Deputy Prime Minister has already met the First Minister, and we will take every opportunity to work jointly on this as we go forward.
Mr. Speaker, how many times must we come here and hear another example of how the state that should be on the side of ordinary people actually becomes the enemy of working class people? Hillsborough, Horizon Post Office scandal, contaminated blood, Windrush,
and the treatment of former armed forces personnel in the LGBT community. And in each of these, the state has become the enemy of the people, but also delayed paying compensation to them. So can this be a watershed where we end this process where the state becomes the enemy of working class people, and that we treat them with the dignity that they deserve, and that their compensation is paid rapidly and not delayed as it has been in all those other cases? And in the case of those freeholders who are still holding out and not paying for the remedial work to their properties, it's about time they paid fines for delaying that work being carried out.
Prime Minister.
This is a really important point, because I don't know how many examples of injustice where people have not been listened to, disregarded. There's been an injustice, and different prime ministers over the years have stood at this dispatch box and quite genuinely made commitments on the back of reports. I don't doubt that for a minute. I think every prime minister who stood here in relation to any of those injustices meant every word that he or she said in response, and yet it goes on. So there is something more fundamental that we have to make time to consider, because I do not want to be back at this dispatch box, or any future Prime Minister at this dispatch box, having a version of the same discussion, which is injustice, disregard, not listened to, not taken seriously after the event, too long, too late for people who desperately need justice. And that's what I mean by turning a corner.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The inquiry report is damning, and the testimony that we heard is utterly devastating. And first and foremost, all of our thoughts are with the victims, the survivors, the bereaved, and everybody affected. In the last Parliament, many of us fought tooth and nail on a cross-party basis to improve the fire safety bill and the building safety bill in order that those people, social tenants and leaseholders who are still living in buildings covered in cladding with other fire safety defects, could get that remediation work as quickly as possible. It is now clear that in some cases, the waterfall system that has been set up, by which we identify who is responsible, is simply not working and is taking far too long. One idea that was on the table in the last Parliament was that in some cases, the government could put the money up to pay for the remediation, to take away the risk, and then use the power of the state and its lawyers to go after those responsible with penalties so that the taxpayer would not lose out. Could I please ask the Prime Minister, who now says it is a moment of change, who has committed to speed things up, whether he will review this idea and see whether it could be used in some limited cases where there has still been no action?
Great question.
Prime Minister.
This is a really important point, and for my own constituency, I know of examples where what happened was a contract, was a subcontract, a subcontract, a subcontract. I think in one case in my constituency, it went through 7 subcontractors before the person who was actually responsible was found, and everybody simply took a cut of the contract and passed it on. That is a real problem. We do have to get to the bottom of that. We can't allow that to happen. Of course, we'll consider any proposals that are put forward in response to this report, but this is a very real problem of contracts simply being subcontracted over and over again, and trying to find accountability in that is very, very difficult.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Prime Minister for this statement today. I recently visited the Grenfell site with Lord Bertang, who's in the chamber today. Excuse me, Speaker. And everybody there at Grenfell wants they want people to be held responsible. Those in boots, but also those in suits. There's a lot of money that's also gone missing, and some have called for the use of joint enterprise in ensuring that everybody is held responsible. And some survivors have written a poetry book, and there's one poem called So What Simon by Mary Gardner, and she said, just the ending, this is not about mercy or grace or kindness, it's about justice and honesty and believing we are all born equal, and that is how we die. No amount of wealth can make us differ so much that where we live becomes a rabbit hutch. Change your minds, you people with power, or give it over and let us flower. Does the Prime Minister agree that justice delayed is justice denied?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do, and I particularly agree that justice isn't a question of grace or kindness. It is an entitlement, and it's an entitlement to every single citizen in this country, and that needs to be honoured as we go forward from here. And can I just take the opportunity to thank all those working on the memorial, which I know is very, very important. It's at an important stage of the work in relation to the memorial, but I know it's very, very important to the community.
Robert General.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. The Grenfell fire was an unimaginable tragedy, but as he rightly said, it was also a comprehensive failure by the British state, and in many respects that comprehensive failure persists to today. I'm grateful for the words that he said about giving all resource and support to the police and to the CPS, because clearly the victims, the survivors, the community of North Kensington want the insights and the answers that they've had partly today, but they also want justice, and that needs to be delivered as soon as possible. Equally, I fully support the effort that he's going to take forwards to see if further regulatory changes are required. They need to be done in a proportionate and effective way, and there are lessons to be learnt from changes that we've made in the recent past. But when doing those, can I urge him to look in particular at the testing facility, the BRE, the status of that and the way it operates, which I think has failed significantly and is laid out in the report. And finally, can I concur with him on the broader point that he made today, which is that when one speaks to the victims and their families, one's left with a very strong sense that many people in social housing in our country feel like they are second-class citizens, that they are being treated with disrespect, and that must end. And would he take forward the work that began with the Social Housing White Paper to ensure that that never happens again in the future?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, I thank him for that question. Yes, all support will be given to the police and the CPS, and I absolutely agree this must be done as swiftly as possible. And I think the police have made a statement in relation to that earlier today. I'll look at the particular point he raises in relation to testing, but I think the whole House needs to come together to recognise that in social housing there has been a profound disrespect for a very long time across a number of communities, and we have to turn a corner on that.
Margaret Millay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask if the Prime Minister will join me following the wildfires of 2022 in Dagenham and Rainham, the ongoing crisis at Launders Lane in Rainham, and now the devastating fire at the Spectrum building, also in my constituency, in commending the outstanding work of our emergency services. And will he comment on the government's plans to improve fire resilience and safety in residential buildings, and to hold those responsible to account when tragedies like this happen?
Prime Minister.
Yes, it's very important that they're held to account, and I thank her for raising the particular issues in relation to Dagenham, and join with her in commending the emergency services who have to respond to these awful incidents, and having spoken to some of the first responders, you get a real sense of the impact it has on them as well. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister has visited the Dagenham scene in the last few days.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and the way he delivered it, and Sir Martin for his comprehensive report. Those needless deaths that happened at Grenfell will never go away and never be forgotten. Those of us that have been on the silent walks for Grenfell every year since it happened and visited many times fully understand the strength of feeling and the anger, the deep anger in the community at this needless loss of life, brought about by a contract culture, deregulation, privatisation, ignorance, and frankly contempt for working class communities by many who should have done much more to protect and defend those people. So I hope the Prime Minister's words will be carried through. Criminal action will follow against those that deliberately neglected those that were in a position of more appalling and extreme danger. Will he also assure the House that the removal of dangerous cladding that has happened on most local authority-owned buildings all over the country will actually now take place also in the leasehold private sector buildings that many of our constituents live in, where they are faced with enormous insurance costs because of the existence of dangerous cladding, and this has gone on now for several years, and as the companies that are responsible for this dangerous cladding refuse to pay up for it, the problem is then forced onto the people who are themselves victims of being put in this position of danger. There are so many lessons to be learned from Grenfell. And I hope that the words the Prime Minister just used about the contract culture in local government, the endless subcontracting, so that those responsible for dangerous conditions evade all responsibility, will end, and we'll end the idea of a local government internal market and instead have the principle of local government delivery of service as the primary responsibility to ensure all citizens live in safety, and that council housing becomes a thing that grows very rapidly in the next few years, and we get more good quality, secure council housing built for the good of the people that are living in desperate housing need, often currently in the private rented sector.
Thank you. The point about leaseholders is a really important point, that we are taking action in relation to, whether it's insurance or other issues that the House is well aware of in relation to leaseholders. It's important that is included in the work that we take forward. Absolutely committed to the quality of council and social housing as we go forward and build those 1.5 million homes. And just on this point about those that lost their lives, it is important, I know the whole House knows this, it isn't just a number. Each and every single one is a human being to be respected and cherished and remembered for who they were, not just a number.
Benkel.
On the council estates in Chelsea, which I have the honour of representing, Grenfell and the incompetence and indifference shown both before and after the tragedy by the local council and by the TMO are still very much discussed. I think one of the striking things that the report brings out is the extraordinary response by the local community where the official response failed. And it was very heartening to hear the Prime Minister talking about a rebalancing of power. And this is absolutely essential. One of the particular things I hope we will be doing is ensure that councils in future gather proper information on disabled people living in social housing, 15 of whom, we must remember, died in the Grenfell Tower fire, in order to ensure that they can be evacuated safely in such a situation. And so, as well as taking action against companies, which I fully support, will the Prime Minister commit to working closely with local authorities to implement the report, so to protect our fellow citizens, whether they live in social housing or indeed anywhere else, from this sort of thing happening again?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
I thank him for that question. I have to say, reading the part of the report that dealt with the indifference and disrespect after the tragedy was really hard. You would have thought, at the very least, after a tragedy like this, with the failures that went before, that in the aftermath they would be treated with the utmost respect, and yet the same disregard carried on afterwards, the lack of basic respect and dignity, and that is part of what this report is all about. In relation to disabled people, it is really important that there are plans in place, and we've taken that forward in relation to people with disabilities who are housed in circumstances where they clearly need a plan for their own evacuation. And yes, of course, we'll work with local authorities on this and all relevant authorities.
Kit Maltos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things I learned in my interactions with the Grenfell bereaved and survivors and Grenfell United during my time as Housing Minister was that their pain was compounded by their frustration at the pace of change, even some years after the fire. And it was a frustration I shared as we tried to make progress on building safety issues. However, one of the things that really did sharpen our minds and make the government machine jump to it was the prospect of external scrutiny. So I wonder, I heard the Prime Minister say that he wants to return to the House annually to update on progress. I'm afraid I don't think that's going to give the government machine, with which I know he will do his best, the kind of impetus that's required. So would he either recommend to whoever is elected as the chair of the select committee that they establish a specific subcommittee to look at progress on the recommendations of this report, or if not, support a cross-party committee of the House being established to drive through these changes and monitor government progress? Because while an annual debate will, I know, be welcome, as I say, I just don't think it's going to give the sense of urgency that's required so that we can address these issues swiftly.
Prime Minister.
This question of external scrutiny is really important, and we will, of course, report annually. There is a recommendation, as he probably knows, in the report about scrutiny, which we want to look at carefully and discuss with the community, because they have strong views on this. Obviously, we'll take into account views of members across the House in relation to this, including whether it should be something the Select Committee should look at. But I'm not sure that it's my role to tell the Select Committee what to look at. But I do agree that this question of external scrutiny and accountability is really important, and we have to make sure the most robust scrutiny is in place.
Murray Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say to my right honourable friend that I don't think I've ever heard him speak more powerfully, more personally, and more movingly than he did in this statement. And I know that the more than 20,000 residents in my constituency who are still living in high-rise blocks with the nightmare of fire risk constantly upon them will welcome what he has said about the way in which the government will take a very consistent and measured view of the recommendations and move to implement them systematically. They'll also welcome what he said about prosecution of those who were responsible for the, and I quote Sir Martin, systematic dishonesty and deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process. I want, though, to turn to remediation, because here I want to reinforce what the Honourable Lady from the Liberal Democrats said. Many of the owners of these blocks have sold on to further owners and further owners beyond that. And the Prime Minister referred to the subcontracting, but there's also been the on-selling. Some of those owners are now living in tax havens, British Virgin Islands and others, and they are simply not complying. They're not even applying for the Building Safety Fund to get this remediation work done. So will he consider very carefully what powers the government can take in order to take control of these buildings, get the work done, and then recover the costs, if necessary, by acquiring and selling the buildings themselves?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising that issue, which is a very real issue. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to look at what further powers may be necessary. I don't think that we can suggest for a minute that the existing legislation, guidance and policy is already there and is sufficient. We need more powers, and we will be looking at that and bring proposals back to the House. And of course there will be a general debate, because I know that many members will want to discuss particular issues in their constituency of those that are fearful of the conditions in which they're living.
Sean Barr.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Prime Minister for his very serious and compassionate statement today. The events of June 2017 do feel like yesterday, and I can't imagine how the people more directly affected must be feeling right now. We must act in every way we can together as much as possible. However, I note that the inquiry report does not make new proposals for transparency and accountability for social housing tenants and leaseholders, particularly around access to fire risk assessments and related information, which is still very, very hard for residents to access. I saw it myself in London. I'm seeing it still in Brighton. And I note that the previous government did not act on calls for housing associations to be subject to freedom of information, and that's despite calls that included from the Information Commissioner themselves as long ago as August 2017. So will the Prime Minister also act now to fix these kinds of gaps in resident empowerment and access to information, which will be very simple and are not covered by the report today?
Prime Minister.
We'll obviously look at all the recommendations that are there from this morning and report back to the House, but we need to look at wider issues as well, and access to risk assessments is a really important issue that we are considering, and there shouldn't be gaps. One of the benefits of a debate across the House will be an opportunity for these and further points to be raised that we will then take back and consider.
Marsha Dakova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, my thoughts are with the victim survivors, the family and the entire Grenfell community today. We know that systemic dishonesty and the many, many injustices meant that the people of Grenfell were treated like second-class citizens. Successive governments, the local authority and industry knew about the risks but failed to act. And as Sir Martin says, the deaths that occurred were entirely avoidable. 7 years on, no one has faced criminal proceedings, and there are still thousands living in homes wrapped in unsafe cladding. I welcome what the Prime Minister said today, and I welcome the way he delivered his statement. And I will also just put on record my thanks that the government will be implementing Phase 1 recommendation to ensure that every disabled person living in a high-rise block will have a personal evacuation plan specific to their needs. Thank you for that. But I asked the Prime Minister today, when he returns to the House to update us, it's vital that those living in unsafe homes have clear deadlines as to when the flammable cladding or the unsafe cladding will be removed so that they can have a decent night's sleep.
I agree with that, and I think that's why we have to recognise the work is going too slowly, and we need to push that work on with clear timetables to ensure that it is done. And just in relation to the first part of her question, the words in the report that these deaths were entirely avoidable must be chilling for all of the family members and the community at large.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister and indeed the Leader of the Opposition for the candour and the tone which they've adopted this afternoon. I think that it was pitch perfect, both of them. But could I just press the Prime Minister on a point which Sir Max Hill, KC, was talking about in broadcast interview this morning, which is the urgent need for justice and for prosecutions to be brought, and a number of colleagues across the House have raised that, and the Prime Minister has already addressed it. But could I just press him on this point, to ensure that there is adequate resource within the policing arena and that there is capacity within the court system in order to bring cases, where appropriate, as speedily as possible. These businesses are inclined to dissolve themselves and disappear into the ether very, very quickly. And just to make sure that there is capacity in both the investigation and in the prosecution arena to make sure that speed is delivered, because people have been waiting, as we all recognise, far, far too long. Prime Minister.
Thank you. And Sir Max Hill obviously has personal experience of these sorts of cases, as in fact have I. We do need to make sure resources in place. We do need to make sure we're clear about the speed of decision making. They're not straightforward decisions, but nonetheless they should be taken as swiftly as possible. And we need to make sure that the courts are in a position to handle the cases as soon as they're ready to go to court, if there are cases to go to court.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join colleagues in remembering the 72 people who lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy, and I say to their friends and family, I will always fight to deliver justice for your loved ones. As chair of the Fire Brigade's Union Parliamentary Group, I'd like to put on record my admiration for the heroic bravery of firefighters who attended that night. The FBU has long said that deregulation and corporate greed was at fault for this catastrophe, and this report vindicates that. Does the Prime Minister agree? And when will the government set up the statutory advisory body on fire policy to give firefighters and control staff to be able to set national standards and to ensure that lessons are learned? When will the timetable for that be set?
Prime Minister.
Well, let me place on record my gratitude to the firefighters on the night. Having been to Grenfell Tower, I can only begin to imagine what it must have been like to have been confronted with the situation they were confronted with and to deal with the circumstances that they had to deal with. And time and again, our first responders are asked by us, rightly, to do very challenging things. They do it, and we should thank them for doing it.
Joy Morrissey.
Thank you. May I thank the Prime Minister for taking these recommendations so seriously, and may I thank him for raising the concerns and the parity of esteem for social housing tenants. I think that is where we've seen problems so many times, so thank you for taking those recommendations forward. And will he join me in paying tribute again to the volunteer organizations, to the founding members of Grenfell United and other charities and churches who worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy?
I thank you for that question. Just to pick up on her thing, there's a passage in the report that highlights the sort of two groups. One group is the TMO, the businesses, those that were charged with responsibility, and the other is those that lived within the tower, and they were treated differently before, during and after. And that is this question of esteem that she rightly touches on, that we must stop talking about and act on now.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts today are with the family and the loved ones of the 72 that died so tragically in the fire. And as the report identifies, those deaths were entirely avoidable due as a result of corporate greed because people put profits before people. But Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are 3,000 medium and high-rise buildings still being monitored by the government because they are clad in unsafe cladding. So will the Prime Minister state how he will support those leaseholders whose lives are on hold at the moment living in those buildings, and what he's going to do to support them? And I stand in solidarity with the families in support for justice and hope they don't wait as long as the families of Hillsborough.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for raising that. There are many premises were being monitored. That needs to continue. We need to ensure that they are safe and bear down on all the relevant authorities to make sure they are safe and give leaseholders the support that they need.
Sarah Gibson.
May I ask the Prime Minister to help and ensure that this type of disaster does not happen again by looking carefully at building control inspection? Often, this is not carried out in person, but on phone calls and by photographs, ever since deregulation. Poor inspection of works across the UK building industry currently means that other disasters like this will happen again and again unless we look carefully at how our building control is worked.
No, I agree with that, and the building control inspection that were carried out in this particular case is a shocking read in the report. It's not, it's particularly grave, but it's not the only example in relation to building control inspection, and we will look at that as we respond to this report.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I thank the Prime Minister for probably the most powerful and heartfelt statement I've ever heard him make, putting the 72 victims of Grenfell and survivors in the community at its heart with that roadmap going forward. Justice, as the Prime Minister said, must be speedy with prosecutions for those that were involved in this systemic dishonesty. But justice also means that those that have the responsibility to pay to make buildings safe in the broader building safety crisis should do so. How is the Prime Minister going to ensure that that happens now at pace?
Well, justice does need to be speedy, and it's important that we make sure that in this case it is swift, but we bear in mind it's already taken 7 years to get to where we are today, which I think doubles the need for that speed. And all with responsibility need to take responsibility, and that's why I thought that the words of one of the members of the inquiry this morning about all of those with responsibility taking this as it were as a template, as a guide to the future is very important. All those with responsibility for building safety includes me, and that's why I'll take that approach in government.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister very much for the tone, the compassion, the understanding and the seriousness in his voice and his words today. The Prime Minister, I believe, honestly, sincerely, speaks for everyone in this House in the way that the statement has been conveyed, and we thank him for that. Can I also convey to all the families, on behalf of my party, DUP, and myself, our collective sympathies. We're never far from our thoughts, even though it's a number of years. The statement has catalogued failures. There are similar buildings in Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will the findings and the recommendations be conveyed to the Minister at the Northern Ireland Assembly with the urgency that is required, and ever mindful that the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and others are financially stretched? So, Prime Minister, what help can be given to deliver the much needed improvements across this great nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Thank you.
Well, thank the honourable member for raising the question in relation to Northern Ireland. Of course, we must work with all of the relevant authorities in Northern Ireland, and I took the opportunity very early after the formation of this government to go to Northern Ireland to make clear that that would be the way I would work on all issues. It is particularly important in relation to the safety of people in the place that they live.
Nestle Caliscan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today, and I associate remarks made in the Chamber in thinking about the victims and the families of those who are still fighting every day for justice. I particularly welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to make sure that they see justice through the criminal justice system, but I want to further ask the Prime Minister for reassurance that through the regulatory frameworks and suggestions that are made through the over 50 recommendations of the report, that the government will work closely with local authorities to make sure that they have the support that they need and that they are able to respond to any additional regulatory burdens that might be put on them in the coming months and years.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. It is important we work on the regulatory framework with local authorities and with all of those charged with responsibility to make sure that yes, there is justice in this particular case, but two, that we take the necessary action to ensure that this never happens again.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's personal commitment to changing the culture and behaviour towards council tenants that allowed this tragedy to happen. It is a national scandal. But can he ensure that residents, tenants and professional firefighters on the front line are heard and really listened to? Because we cannot trust those who caused the tragedy in the first place to put things right.
I think this is a really important issue because this is an example of a type which is where those concerned for their own safety, for the place that they live, make points, put forward issues, raise concerns, and then not listened to. And that isn't just in this case. It's a characteristic of the way that not just housing, but other aspects of life are dealt with. And we have to make sure that we listen to those that are most concerned. It is their place, it's their home. They are entitled to feel safe and secure in their home. And it's our responsibility to make sure that they are.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Prime Minister so painfully said, the Grenfell fire destroyed lives and ripped families apart. But constituents of mine are suffering too, afraid to go to sleep at night because they live in buildings that were built more recently than Grenfell with fire safety risks. The building standards that informed the recladding of Grenfell and the building of more recent blocks of flats were strong on thermal insulation to save energy costs, but very, very weak on fire safety, and their implementation has been even worse, as we now know from this report. Other jurisdictions' building regulations can cover both thermal properties and fire safety risks. So how long will it take for the UK building reg standards to catch up?
I think this is one of the issues we're going to have to look at in light of the report, but I absolutely accept that there are people today living in accommodation where they feel for their safety because of the conditions that they're living in. And having spoken to some of them myself, I got a sense of what it's like to every night worry about the safety of yourself, your family, and particularly those with children.
Nadia Whitton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statements and his commitments today. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Prime Minister has said, the report makes clear that Conservative government's obsession with deregulation meant safety issues were ignored, delayed or disregarded. It says that the government was well aware of the deadly risk of cladding before the fire, but failed to act. It concludes that all 72 deaths were avoidable. This morning, Grenfell United, survivors and bereaved families urged our new government to break old habits and bring systemic change, both in terms of separating government from corporate lobbying and tackling social and racial injustices and inequalities. Will the Prime Minister undertake this work without delay?
Prime Minister.
I read very carefully what the report said about deregulation. I do think, as we go forward from here, we have to avoid the habit of simply blaming somebody else for everything and pull together and say it's our responsibility. We are a new government. Irrespective of where the failure lay, it's our responsibility now to take this forward to ensure safety. And I know that's a sentiment shared across the House, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the approach that he's taken. I think if we do it in that way, we can do what the survivors, the bereaved, the families, the communities most want, which is show our determination to ensure this does never happen again.
Alan Gemmill.
Madam Deputy Speaker, today's report lists a series of terrible failures that let down the Grenfell community. The Grenfell fire affected communities in every part of the UK, and I wanted to pass on the thoughts of my constituents in Irvine to families and loved ones. A fire at a 14-storey block of flats in Irvine in 1999 spread via external cladding. The Garnet Court fire resulted in one fatality and resulted in changes to Scottish building regulations. The then local MP fought to have those building regulations implemented, and I hope my right honourable friend will look at the lessons from the Garnet Court fire as he starts to address this terrible injustice.
Prime Minister.
Yes, we have to look at this question of external cladding. I mean, some measures have been taken in the last 7 years, as I referenced in my statement, but we need to look again. And the description that I was given when I was at the Tower of how the fire spread and the role played by the cladding was very, very chilling.
John McDonnell.
Can I just say it's been difficult to contain in one's anger, having read the report now, the summary of the report. As a West London MP, like many of us, we visited the site soon after, and in those following months we met with the victims, the families of the victims, we met with the firefighters and the call centre operators who were traumatised, and some have never recovered. We met with local representatives. At that point I called it social murder and was castigated for using that expression. This report defines it was social murder. We need now, exactly as the Prime Minister said, urgent action. We've been promised a debate. For that debate, could we have the definitive report for each of our constituencies on what action has been taken, what action will be taken, and what the deadline will be? Can I return to one of the recommendations specifically in the report, which is 113.7, which is in the building regulations, we defined higher buildings as above 7 stories or 18 metres. That takes no account of those other properties where there are vulnerable residents in particular and are now at risk. The recommendation is to urgently review those regulations. Could we have a timetable for that review of the regulations? Because it does have consequences for many of our constituents.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for making that point. On the question of the debate, I do think it's really important that as much information is made available as possible and that we're able to deal with the questions that members of this House raise, which is why we look at the date of that debate. I want it to be as quickly as possible, but I don't want it to be so quick that members will be frustrated because they will rightly want information or assurances that need a little bit of working through. So I'll try and make sure that is that happens. And on the question of the safety of buildings that aren't of a specific height, that is, I think, amongst the issues that we have to look at here. We're all well aware of these cases. They are very troubling, and that has to be part of the debate. Thank you.
Well, that concludes that very serious statement. I'll give the front benches some time to vacate and allow the new front bench ministers and shadow ministers to take their seats. We'll now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Budget Responsibility Bill Committee.
No.
Order. Order.
Budget Responsibility Bill.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker. Please use our names when addressing the Chair, Madam Chair or Chair. We begin with Amendment 9 to Clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider all other amendments selected and the clauses to the bill. I now call the Shadow Minister, Nigel Huddleston, to move Amendment 9.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And can I first take the opportunity to congratulate you on your election. I promise, I'm going to promise to try not to try your patience over the coming weeks, years and so on, but we'll see how things go. Now, I wish to primarily speak today to the Opposition Amendment 9 and, of course, consequential Amendment 10, which effectively seeks to ensure that the fiscal lock proposed in this bill should also include any changes to the fiscal rules and would require the Office for Budget Responsibility to produce a report on their effect on public finances. The Office for Budget Responsibility was, of course, constructed by a Conservative Chancellor following the poor forecasting record of the previous Labour government. Between 2000 and 2010, the then Labour government's forecasts for economic growth were out by an average of £13 billion, and their forecasts for the budget deficit 3 years ahead were out by an average of £40 billion. Their forecasts therefore lacked credibility, and to re-establish confidence and credibility, the OBR was created by the then Conservative government. But while Labour lacked economic credibility in the past, I'm afraid they still lack it now. The facts simply do not stack up to the false claim that they have inherited the worst economic circumstances since the Second World War. They transparently have not. Contrary to the rewriting of history that the current Labour government are attempting, when we took over from Labour back in 2010, inflation was 3.4%, whereas when they took over from us, it was 2.2%. The annual deficit is half what we inherited in 2010. Unemployment is about half now than what it was in 2010. And we handed Labour the fastest economic growth in the G7. The dominant political and economic narrative since the Second World War is, in fact, as has been widely commented on, that every single Labour government ends up with unemployment higher at the end of their time in power than when they took over from the Conservatives preceding them. The British public should not be taken for fools. Just because Labour keep claiming something, it doesn't mean it suddenly becomes true, which is why clarity over plans and rules are so important. The fiscal rules are, of course, restrictions on fiscal policy set by the government to constrain its own decisions on spending and taxes. The fiscal rules set by the previous government said that the debt to GDP ratio should be falling within a 5-year horizon, and the ratio of the annual budget deficit to GDP should be below 3% by the end of the same period. Labour's manifesto for the election proposed the following fiscal rules: balancing the current budget so that day-to-day costs are met by revenues, and debt must be falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the forecast. So, on the surface, the debt rules appear to be broadly the same under the new government. The government has even said it has an ironclad commitment to reduce government debt. It is therefore of critical importance what definition of debt is used for the fiscal rules. And clearly, any changes to the fiscal rules are financially significant decisions because they affect how much the government can borrow and spend. At second reading, the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury said our fiscal rules are non-negotiable. Great. But why then has the Chancellor repeatedly failed to rule out that she will change the definition of debt in her fiscal rules to allow presumably massive borrowing? The government cannot run from the scrutiny that they should be subjected to if they're considering making such a change. We believe our amendment requiring an OBR report on changes to the fiscal rules is entirely consistent with the government's stated policy intent and should therefore be a fairly uncontentious amendment. After all, at second reading, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury said, and I quote, "The announcement of a fiscally significant measure should always be accompanied by an independent assessment of its economic impact and fiscal implications in order to support transparency and accountability," end quote. Well, we agree, and clearly not accepting our amendment would be contrary to these goals. Because clearly, changing the fiscal rules would be a fiscally significant measure in anybody's books. Furthermore, the Chief Secretary said that fiscal discipline and sound money is the bedrock of our plans. Well, changing the fiscal rules would be changing the foundations, would be changing that bedrock. Transparency and clarity is important in relation to public finances, because ministers should never forget it is not their money they are spending, it's the public's money. The public have a right to know how their money is being spent, and government is about making difficult choices with limited resources. The British public recognise that with government spending above £1.2 trillion per year, the government clearly does have choices. It is not an endless supply of money, but it is a very, very large amount. And in the last few weeks, the new Labour government chose to spend the public's money on pay settlements for their union friends rather than spend money supporting pensioners. This is estimated to cost about £10 billion. They also chose to spend £8.3 billion on a public energy company, £7.3 billion on a national wealth fund. So far from inheriting a £22 billion black hole, they actually just spent £25 billion creating one within the first few weeks of coming to power.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making a fantastic speech on the importance of the responsibility of our public finances. Much of this bill is concerned with responsibility and transparency. I don't know if my honourable friend knows, but did the government publish an impact assessment when it took away the winter fuel allowance?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for making that point. My understanding is that they have not published an impact assessment, and would normally be the case for something with such a significant impact. And I think this speaks to the whole narrative we're hearing from the opposition, claiming one thing, but actually, in fact, the facts speak differently. As I said, so far from inheriting a £22 billion black hole, they've actually spent, or committed to spending, an additional £25 billion. That is a choice that they made. So the claim that the Labour government are having to take winter fuel allowances away from millions of pensioners is a response to unexpected financial constraints just simply does not stack up with the facts, or indeed the words of the Chancellor herself, who on the 25th of March 2014, yes, a decade ago, said, quote, "We are the party who have said that we will cut the winter fuel allowance for the richest pensioners and means test that benefit to save money," end quote. That's a direct quote in Hansard from the current Chancellor. So no, their restricting of winter fuel payments is not a response to financial circumstance. It's a long-established, clearly stated Labour policy intent, a deliberate policy choice, but a policy that they conveniently forgot to tell the public about in the run-up to the last election. But I hope that the government can be straight with the public on this point about the fiscal rules, accept the amendment that we are proposing, and provide the assurance to all members and the outside world that there is no sleight of hand here, that the bill they propose will work as they say it is intended, and will include financially significant decisions, such as on the levels of government borrowing, on the fiscal rules. I would appreciate it, therefore, if the Minister could confirm in their wind-up that the government does not intend to change the definition of debt in their fiscal rules, does not intend to practice some accounting trick to hide the level of government borrowing, and confirm that the government does indeed wish to be clear and transparent about the public finances. If the Labour Party vote against our amendment, it will merely prove that they are planning to change their fiscal rules at the budget, to borrow more money, increase debt, and run away from independent OBR scrutiny, the very opposite of the stated intent of this bill. Thank you.
Marvellous. We come to our first maiden speech. Dr. Oh my, forgive me. The question is that Amendment 9 to Clause 1 be made. Is that perfect? Now we will now move on to more substantial contributions, and I go to the first maiden speech, Dr. Jeevan Sundar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to rise and give my maiden speech in this House. Like every member across this House, it is the greatest honour privilege and responsibility of my lifetime to represent my community of Loughborough, Shepshed and the villages. But I rise at this, the most difficult moment for our communities, for our country, since the Second World War, when many feel despondency, despair and anger. Now, I know that every member across this House wants our communities to succeed, to contribute to our national success. It is what my community has done before and will do again, with hope and determination. Now, my story does not begin in Loughborough. I was not born there, but it is where my friends, who are now my neighbours, who have made it my home. My story, instead, begins in rural Punjab, 4,000 miles away, where my father was born almost 70 years ago, where his chances of dying before his 5th birthday were 1 in 4. Today, a child born in the same place is around 9 times less likely to die. That is what economic growth means. It means less suffering, it means less misery, it means less death. That's why I became an economist, to build prosperity and to lessen misery. I learnt my trade in the Treasury, and I then went to work in Somaliland, one of the poorest nations on earth, where I helped write their economic policy, their budget, and their national development plan. But it's also where I saw the horrors of climate change lead to drought, hunger, and death. But it is where I learned that even in the darkest of hours and the most difficult of moments, we can build prosperity. And now I stand here as the elected Member of Parliament for my community. And it says something remarkable about our nation, that the fact that I, as the son of immigrants, am standing here is in and of itself unremarkable. It speaks to our common culture, a culture forged of different backgrounds, a culture that not only rejects the violence we saw over the summer, but completely rejects its reasoning too. My election represents an historic first for my community. I am a member of an underrepresented minority. I am, of course, the first Member of Parliament elected by the men and women of Loughborough that has a beard. And to the organisers of the Beard of the Year competition, call me. Luckily for me, my dad is not eligible for that particular competition. And I know that the Right Honourable Member for Islington North has won the award several times. I hope he doesn't mind me winning the prize this time, as long as I let him win the argument. My predecessor in this place, Jane Hunt, was not a contender for this award, but no one can doubt her commitment to Team Loughborough, and every single member across this House and across my community wishes her the very best, especially as she has recovered from cancer. Her predecessor, the Baroness Morgan, has talents that are well known both in this and the other place. And before her, my good friend and mentor, Andy Reid. For those members who know Andy, they know that he is still a leading figure of sports policy. And they will also know that Andy is the nicest man in British politics. It is his character that I hope to live up to in this place. But I do rise, Madam Chair, at what is the most difficult time for our communities and our nation since 1945. Our communities are in crisis. Wages in my constituency, £10,000 lower than had we grown at new Labour rates. The divides caused by deindustrialisation have widened from cracks into chasms. Young men who used to leave school and get good jobs are now 20% less likely to get any job. And in our most deprived neighbourhoods, life expectancy falling before the pandemic. But more than any fact, more than any figure, the despair, the despondency, the anger. And across and beyond our shores, war in Europe once more, democracy in danger. And most seriously of all, a planet that is burning. For my community, the hottest summer we have ever known, followed by the worst flooding we have ever seen, that destroyed homes. Destruction the Prime Minister and I saw when we visited the homes of Ian and Alan. No one should wake up in the morning to find their home destroyed by flooding, and that will only become more common in the years ahead. What we do in the next decade will determine the fate of our communities, democracy, and our planet. We will either rise to this moment, build prosperity for all, protect democracy, and stop emitting carbon, or everything we hold dear will crumble and fall. Now, previous generations have shown us that we can rise to our moment, to this, a moment that threatens us. Our country stood alone against fascism in Europe and won. I think today of my constituent, David Williams, 104 years old, who flew Spitfires in the war. As that generation rose to their moment, so can we. And it is my community who has shown me that we can. When the waters came and the floods rose, my constituents, Kaz and Carl, did not stop and pause to think if they could help, but only how they could help. They organised collections, they provided refuge, they looked after perfect strangers, not asking if, but how. It is their spirit that I carry into this place, not asking if, but how. How can we build prosperity and protect our planet from burning? We can do so, Madam Chair, by investing in our green transition. That creates good jobs and gets wages rising for the people and places left behind when the factories closed. That is what we can achieve, and we are seeing it work already in the United States. In my community has world-leading hydrogen research and industry. Green hydrogen we need for fertilizer and to keep our trucks moving. It is not a coincidence that I have chosen to speak in this debate with Treasury ministers on the front bench, and I say to them, get out the checkbook. They're very excited by that, because I will be asking for money from both the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy. But this is about more than cash. It is about rebuilding hope and prosperity, as a previous generation rose to their moment. In the midst of the most destructive war in the history of humankind, an economist wrote a report that still defines our nation. He wrote, "Freedom from want cannot be forced upon a democracy. It cannot be given to them. It must be won by them." And it was won by them. They built prosperity for all, with good jobs across our country, education for all, housing for all, healthcare for all. As that generation rose to their moment, so will we, by building prosperity, protecting our planet, and ending despair and despondency. As previous generations rose to their moment, so we will too, with the hope and determination that defines our communities, that defines our country. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Indeed. Very strong maiden speech without a script in hand. Your parents will be proud. Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a delight as ever to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to congratulate the new member for Loughborough on his maiden speech, his kind comments about his predecessor, Jane Hunt, a great colleague of this House, and it was one of my great pleasures in my previous role as Minister for Science and Research to visit the fine university that he now represents. I wish him and they well, and I wish him all the very luck with his front bench in procuring the financial support that he seeks. Madam Deputy Chairman, this is a disreputable bill, if we're brutally honest, and it's a piece of political theatre that all of us in this House, on both sides, should think very strongly about giving our support to. The history of this place is of legislation made in haste, about which this House subsequently repents in leisure. And I say in all seriousness and in the spirit of this place, that at a time when there is a low trust in politics, do our constituents, the honourable members' constituents, when they trooped into the ballot box and returned him to this place only weeks ago, do they seriously expect that our role is to give away even more of our responsibilities? Do our constituents, can any of us hand on heart say our constituents know what and who the OBR are? Do the electors of Bristol North West, Hampstead and Highgate, Richmond Park, or indeed Arundel and South Downs send us here to this place only to give away our duties and responsibility to unnamed, unknown, unelected officials, well-meaning no doubt, of the Office of Budget Responsibility? Madam Deputy Chairman, hands on the face of a stopped clock are sometimes more accurate than the OBR forecasts, as at least they are correct, for sure, twice a day. And in truth, this legislation put together at breakneck speed has more holes than a Swiss cheese. If you look at paragraph